Case 1. The Joe Horn Shooting. Pasadena, Texas. November 2007. It was early afternoon on November 14, 2007, in a quiet residential neighborhood near Timberline Drive in Pasadena, Texas. Two men had just forced their way into a home. They moved methodically through the interior, gathering jewelry, cash, and electronics, before heading back toward the street with a bag of stolen property. The home next door belonged to 61-year-old Joe Horn. Horn had been watching. He had called 911, and for several minutes he stayed on that line as a dispatcher urged him, repeatedly and directly, not to go outside. The instructions were unambiguous. Officers were on the way. Property wasn't worth dying over. Stay inside. Horn didn't stay inside. The 911 recording captured the entire sequence. Horn referenced a Texas law he believed gave him legal standing to intervene. He told the dispatcher, more than once, that he wasn't going to let the men walk away. The dispatcher kept telling him not to go out. Horn kept moving toward the door. A plainclothes Pasadena police detective happened to be in the area and had parked a short distance from the property. He observed what was unfolding but hadn't yet made contact with anyone or identified himself. When the two men stepped off the neighbor's property carrying the stolen bag, Horn stepped out of his front door with the 12-gauge shotgun. There was a brief verbal exchange. The audio is difficult to parse clearly at this point. 3 shots followed in rapid succession. Both men went down. Neither survived. A bag containing the stolen items was found nearby. Neither man was carrying a firearm. They had burglary tools and the property they'd taken. That was it. Investigators identified the two men as Hernando Riascos Torres, age 38, who had been living under the alias Miguel Antonio de Jesus, and Diego Ortiz, age 30. Torres was a Colombian national who had been deported from the United States following a cocaine trafficking conviction in 1999. He had re-entered the country illegally. Horn was questioned and released. He was not arrested. The shooting split the public sharply. Protesters gathered outside Horn's home. Civil rights advocates raised concerns about the fact that both men were Hispanic and unarmed at the moment Horn opened fire. On the other side, supporters argued that Horn had exercised a legitimate right and that the men had no business taking property that didn't belong to them. The legal question the shooting raised was specific and significant. Texas law, revised earlier that same year, allows a person to use deadly force in defense of property under certain conditions. Those conditions include nighttime, a fleeing suspect who cannot otherwise be stopped, and property that cannot be recovered by other means. Horn's situation occurred in broad daylight, on a neighbor's property rather than his own, which complicated the analysis considerably. The case went to a Harris County grand jury. Prosecutors and legal experts walked the panel through the relevant statutes, the 911 recording, the ballistic evidence, the plainclothes detective's observations, and the positions of the men when the shots connected. On June 30, 2008, District Attorney Ken Magidson announced the result: no indictment. The grand jury had concluded that Horn's actions did not rise to a criminal offense under Texas law. The deaths were ruled justifiable. The ruling didn't end the debate. Legal scholars continued to argue about whether the property defense statutes had been correctly applied. Civil rights groups continued to question whether race had played a role in how the community and the legal system responded. What the ruling did end was any possibility of prosecution. The case remains one of the most examined applications of the Texas Castle Doctrine, not because the facts were unclear. They were documented in real time on a 911 recording, but because those facts pushed the law to its edge and forced a grand jury to decide where that edge was. Case 2. Byron Smith. Little Falls, Minnesota, November 2012. Thanksgiving Day, November 22, 2012. 17-year-old Nicholas Brady broke a window on the north side of a home in Little Falls, Minnesota, and climbed inside. His 18-year-old cousin, Hailey Kiffer, was waiting nearby and planned to follow. What neither of them could see was 64-year-old Byron Smith, already stationed in the basement at the bottom of the staircase. He was sitting in a chair. He had a Mini 14 rifle across his lap. He had been waiting for something like this. He had also placed a digital recorder on a shelf nearby. Smith had told people for weeks that he believed he was being specifically targeted. He said a previous burglary had cost him his late father's prisoner of war watch, cash, and tools. In the weeks since, he had taken the light bulbs out of exterior fixtures, started carrying a handgun inside his own home, and spent long hours in the basement, watching, waiting. By November, he had removed himself almost entirely from the rest of the house. He sat below the stairs with the rifle, the recorder running. The audio captured what happened next. Glass broke upstairs. Footsteps moved across the main floor. A figure began descending the narrow staircase. Smith waited until he could see the lower half of the person's body, then fired. Brady fell to the concrete. Smith walked to him and fired again, at close range. Then he dragged the body to the back of the basement and covered it with a tarp. He sat back down. He waited. Roughly 10 minutes later, Kiefer came down the same stairs. She didn't know her cousin was dead. Smith fired as she reached the lower steps. She fell. He fired again. When she continued to make noise, he delivered another round, this one close, under her chin, while she was lying on the floor. The recording caught all of it, including Smith's commentary between shots. He didn't call 911. He left both bodies where they were overnight. The following morning, he went to a neighbor and asked about finding a lawyer. That neighbor called the Morrison County Sheriff's Office. When deputies arrived, Smith told them he had 2 bodies in his basement and led them inside. The scene matched the audio exactly. During the investigation, detectives focused on a specific and damning timeline. The initial shots that stopped the intruders versus the additional shots fired after the immediate threat had ended. Brady was already on the ground when Smith fired the close-range round. Kiefer was already incapacitated when Smith delivered what prosecutors later called the finishing shot. At trial in April 2014, the jury heard the recording in full. They heard Smith's own words. They deliberated for only a few hours. Guilty on 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. Guilty on 2 additional counts of second-degree murder. The judge imposed life in prison without parole, mandatory under Minnesota law for first-degree murder. Smith's defense team argued on appeal that Minnesota's Castle Doctrine shielded his actions. The state Supreme Court rejected that argument directly, writing that the doctrine cannot protect a homeowner who continues using lethal force after any threat has passed. The legal protection for home defense ends at the moment the danger ends. What Smith did after that moment was, in the court's assessment, deliberate, unjustified killing. Byron Smith remains incarcerated at the Minnesota Correctional Facility in Oak Park Heights. He will never leave prison. The Little Falls case is taught and cited in legal discussions precisely because it draws the line so clearly. It wasn't the initial shots that led to a murder conviction. It was every shot that came after. Case 3. Derek, Condan, and Christine, Jenayan. Bingham County, Idaho, March 2024. Hours before dawn on a night in mid-March 2024, a white Honda CR-V parked roughly a mile from an isolated farmhouse on West 600 North in Bingham County, Idaho. The driver wasn't making a mistake. He had chosen that spot deliberately, a remote lava rock area where a vehicle wouldn't attract attention. He walked the rest of the way on foot. 39-year-old Derek Condan arrived at the property carrying a 9mm handgun, a suppressed .22 caliber pistol, duct tape, 2 sets of handcuffs, rope, and a black ski mask. He forced a rear window with a screwdriver. He was inside before anyone in the house stirred. 85-year-old Christine Jenayan was asleep in her bedroom. When she opened her eyes, Condan was standing over her with a flashlight and a gun aimed directly at her face. He struck her at least once before she was fully upright. Blood was found on her pillow. He ordered her out of the room and guided her at gunpoint into the living room. where he locked her wrists to a wooden chair using the handcuffs he'd brought. He wanted valuables. He pressed the barrel of the gun against her head. She told him there were 2 safes downstairs. As he moved back and forth between the basement and the main floor searching, he encountered her adult disabled son in a lower room. According to the prosecutor's report, this discovery made him angrier. He came back upstairs with escalating threats, telling Christine more than once that she was going to die. Then he went downstairs again. Christine started moving the chair. Inch by inch, dragging the legs across the carpet, she pulled herself toward her bedroom. Under her pillow was a loaded .357 Magnum revolver. She had trained shooting competitors for years, and that experience, investigators later noted, was what made what followed possible. Still handcuffed to the chair, she retrieved the revolver. She moved back to the living room. She hid the gun between the armrest and the cushion of a nearby couch. She waited. When Condan came back upstairs and renewed his threats, Christine believed the moment had arrived. She fired twice. Both rounds struck him in the chest. He raised his 9mm and emptied the magazine. Bullets tore through the room. Christine was hit in the abdomen, leg, arm, and chest. Condan staggered into the kitchen and collapsed. He died there. Christine fell to the floor, still cuffed to the chair. She could not move. She lay there for approximately 10 hours until her son managed to bring her a phone. She called 911 just after noon. Deputies arrived at 12:17 p.m. What they found matched her account precisely. Condan deceased in the kitchen. Firearms, ammunition, restraints, and burglary tools throughout the house. Footprints and tire tracks leading back to the parked Honda, where investigators found cash, a money clip, additional ammunition, and materials consistent with robbery preparation. A 47-page deputy report documented everything. Christine was airlifted to Eastern Idaho Regional Medical Center for emergency surgery. Bingham County Prosecutor Ryan Jolly conducted a formal review. His conclusion was unambiguous. Christine's use of deadly force was fully justified under Idaho law. Condan's actions, armed forced entry, physical assault, restraint, sustained threats, and clear intent to kill, created an immediate and documented threat to her life. Jolly stated that if Condan had survived, he would have faced charges including attempted murder, kidnapping, burglary, robbery, and aggravated battery. He described what Christine had done as one of the most extraordinary acts of self-preservation he had ever reviewed. Case 4. The Broken Arrow Shooting. Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, March 2017. They had already been on the property once that morning. Maxwell Cook, Jacob Redfern, and Jacob Woodruff had broken into a detached garage on the Peters property in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, sometime before noon on a Monday in late March 2017. They took liquor and speakers from a recreational room connected to the garage. Then they left. Then they came back. By the time they returned, around 12:30 in the afternoon, their target had shifted. The main house was next. They believed it held more valuable property. A fourth person, 21-year-old Elizabeth Rodriguez, was parked nearby coordinating the operation and directing the group on where to go. All 3 teens wore masks. 2 of them brought weapons, brass knuckles and a knife. They shattered the glass on the back door and stepped inside. 23-year-old Zachary Peters was already home. When the sound of breaking glass reached him, he moved to an AR-15 kept in the residence. The teens had already crossed through several interior rooms by the time he encountered them. The confrontation was over in seconds. There was no conversation, no standoff. Peters fired. 2 of the teens went down inside the kitchen. The third made it out the door and collapsed in the driveway. All 3 were dead before paramedics cleared the scene. Peters went to his bedroom and called 911. On the recording, his voice was controlled. He described what had happened, identified the weapon he'd used, and waited for officers to arrive. Neither he nor his father, who had also been inside the house, had any injuries. While investigators were still processing the scene, Elizabeth Rodriguez walked into the Broken Arrow Police Department. She told detectives she had information about the shooting. During questioning, she admitted to planning the burglary, driving the teens to the address, and waiting in the vehicle while they went inside. She knew the property. She had chosen it because she believed there were items worth taking. That admission, combined with the earlier burglary of the detached garage, the masks, the weapons, and the break-in of the main home, established that the teens had been engaged in a planned, escalating criminal operation, not a spontaneous mistake. Rodriguez was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree felony murder, among other charges. Under Oklahoma's felony murder statute, anyone who participates in a dangerous felony resulting in death can face murder charges regardless of who fires the weapon. She later pleaded guilty to reduced charges of second-degree murder and burglary and received a 32-year sentence. Wagner County Assistant District Attorney Jack Thorpe cleared Peters of any wrongdoing on April 3, 2017. He stated that Peters had acted within Oklahoma's Castle Doctrine and was fully justified in using deadly force against armed, masked intruders who had broken through a locked door into his occupied home. The legal analysis, he said, was straightforward. You're watching Daily Crime Archive. These cases are chosen because the facts matter and the details matter. The difference between a justified shooting and a murder conviction often comes down to a single shot, a single second, or a single recorded statement. We go through all of it. If this is the kind of coverage you've been looking for, thorough, documented, fact-driven, subscribe and turn on the bell. We cover new cases every week, and your support is what makes that possible. 6 more cases. Let's continue. Case 5. Andrea Miller and Thomas Greer. Long Beach, California, July 2014. Thomas Greer was 80 years old. He lived alone in Long Beach, California, and according to police records, he had been targeted before. On the evening of July 22, 2014, 28-year-old Andrea Miller and her partner, Gus Richard Adams, entered Greer's home through the garage. Investigators later confirmed this was not their first visit to the property. They were familiar with it. They knew he kept cash in a safe. What they didn't account for was that Greer would be there. When Greer encountered both intruders already inside his home, the confrontation turned physical almost immediately. He was knocked to the ground, sustaining injuries to his shoulder and collarbone. Miller and Adams moved through the house, forced open the safe, took the cash inside, and headed for the exit. Greer, from the floor, reached for a .22 caliber revolver he kept in the home. He followed the pair into the rear alley behind his property. The exact distance at which the shot was fired varies slightly across accounts, but the course sequence is consistent across all verified reporting. Miller was moving away from the house when Greer fired a single round. It struck her in the torso. She collapsed in the alley and died at the scene. Adams kept running and was arrested by responding Long Beach officers shortly afterward. One element of this case received significant public attention. Greer told officers and later reporters that Miller had shouted she was pregnant during the encounter. The Los Angeles County coroner confirmed she was not. That discrepancy drew extensive media discussion, not because it changed the medical findings, but because it raised questions about Greer's perception and state of mind in the alley. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office reviewed the evidence, the forced entry, the assault, the injuries documented on Greer's body, the location of the shooting, the recovered firearms, and the burglary itself. The question prosecutors had to answer was whether they could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Greer had not acted out of genuine fear. They concluded they could not. No charges were filed against him. The case then shifted to Adams. Under California's felony murder principles, a participant in a dangerous felony, such as residential burglary or robbery, can be held criminally responsible for a death that occurs during that felony, even if someone else pulled the trigger. Adams was charged with first-degree robbery and first-degree burglary. He pleaded guilty and received more than 10 years in state prison. The Long Beach case is frequently cited in discussions about the specific vulnerabilities of elderly homeowners and the legal standard for defensive force when a suspect is fleeing. Prosecutors examined it carefully and determined the circumstances didn't support a criminal case. The documented assault, the age disparity, and Greer's stated fear formed the foundation of that conclusion. Case 6. Jerome Ersland. Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, May 2009. Just before 6 p.m. on May 19, 2009, 16-year-old Antoine Speedy Parker pushed through the front door of Reliable Discount Pharmacy in South Oklahoma City wearing a ski mask. His 14-year-old accomplice, Javonte Ingram, followed behind him holding a handgun that had been supplied by adult organizers waiting outside in a stolen getaway car. The plan was quick. Threaten the staff, take the cash and medications, leave. Pharmacist Jerome Ersland was already reaching for his own handgun before either teen made it to the counter. Two female employees ran to the back room. Ersland drew his pistol and fired once. The bullet struck Parker in the head. Parker fell backward, unconscious. Ingram turned and ran out the door. Up to this precise moment, investigators and prosecutors later agreed, Ersland's response was consistent with lawful self-defense. He faced an armed robbery in progress. The initial shot was a defensive act. What happened next is what defined the entire case. After Ingram fled, Ersland ran outside the pharmacy in pursuit. His chronic back problems stopped him from maintaining the chase. He came back inside in under a minute. Surveillance cameras documented everything. Parker was still on the floor. He was motionless, lying on his back, not attempting to move. Ersland walked to the counter. He set down the first gun. He opened a drawer. He retrieved a second handgun. He walked back to Parker, who remained flat and unresponsive. And he fired 5 more shots into Parker's torso. The medical examiner's autopsy established something crucial. It was those 5 abdominal wounds, not the initial headshot, that caused Parker's death. Oklahoma County District Attorney David Prater drew the legal line in public statements before the case even reached a courtroom. The first shot, justified self-defense. The 5 shots that followed, an execution of a wounded, unconscious, unarmed teenager. That distinction held throughout the prosecution. In 2011, a jury heard the surveillance footage, the ballistic evidence, the medical examiner's findings, and Ersland's own statements, including televised interviews in which he had insisted Parker was still moving and still a threat. Investigators presented the video alongside those claims. They did not align. Ersland was convicted of first-degree murder. The jury recommended a life sentence with the possibility of parole. District Judge Ray Elliott imposed that sentence in July 2011. The Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed the conviction in 2013, writing explicitly that Ersland had not been convicted for the initial defensive act. He had been convicted for 5 additional shots fired into a teenager who was already incapacitated and posed no further danger. The adult organizers of the robbery also faced consequences under Oklahoma's felony murder statute. The surviving accomplice, Ingram, was processed through the juvenile system. The adults who planned the robbery and supplied the firearm faced first-degree murder charges stemming from Parker's death. Jerome Ersland remains incarcerated, serving his life sentence. The pharmacy case endures in legal education and discussion because it isolates the moment when lawful defense becomes unlawful violence with unusual precision. The camera saw everything. The medical examiner established the cause of death. The legal system answered accordingly. Case 7. Marcus, Kaarma, Missoula, Montana, April 2014. For 3 weeks before the night of April 27, 2014, 33-year-old Marcus Kaarma had been telling people what he intended to do. His home in Missoula had been burglarized. Items had been taken from his garage. He was angry about it, and according to witness testimony collected during the investigation, he had been explicit. He was staying up late at night. He was waiting for whoever had done it to come back. He intended to shoot them. He and his partner, Janelle Fleger, installed motion sensors in the garage and set up a baby monitor aimed at the interior. They left the garage door partly open on multiple nights. A purse was positioned in a visible location from the street. This was, investigators later argued, a trap. 17-year-old Darren Didi was a German exchange student from Hamburg, living with a local host family for the school year. On the night in question, he had been moving through unlocked garages in the neighborhood, what's sometimes called garage hopping, looking for alcohol with other teenagers. He saw the partially open door. He stepped inside. Motion sensors activated. The alert appeared on the baby monitor inside the house. Karma came out with a 12-gauge shotgun. He did not shout a warning. He did not attempt to determine whether anyone inside was armed. He stopped at the threshold of the garage doorway and fired 4 times into the darkness. 3 shots tracked low and laterally, as if following movement. The 4th shot was higher. It struck Didi in the head. A separate pellet pattern hit his arm. He collapsed inside the garage. He had no weapon. He had no stolen property. He had been inside the garage only briefly when the shots were fired. Didi died at the scene. He was 17 years old. Missoula County prosecutors built their case around a specific legal theory, that Karma had not been responding to a threat. He had been preparing for one. The motion sensors, the baby monitor, the staged garage, the open door, and his pre-incident statements combined to form what they characterized as deliberate preparation to use lethal force against whoever walked in. Montana's Castle Doctrine protects homeowners who use deadly force against intruders in occupied structures. Prosecutors argued that protection doesn't extend to setting up conditions designed to attract an intruder and then shooting blindly into the dark without any assessment of the threat. The defense countered that Karma had been repeatedly victimized, that he feared for his family, and that he believed an intruder in his garage at night could reasonably be considered dangerous. The jury in Missoula County heard the full body of evidence in December 2014. The surveillance apparatus, the pattern of the shots, Karma's own statements before the night of the shooting, and the fact that Didi was hit in the head from behind while trying to exit. None of it described a reactive homeowner defending against an immediate threat. The jury found him guilty of deliberate homicide. On February 12, 2015, District Judge Ed McLean sentenced Karma to 70 years in prison with no possibility of parole for a minimum of 20 years. The judge stated that Karma had been motivated more by anger and a desire for confrontation than by genuine fear for his family's safety. Didi's parents traveled from Germany for the trial. After sentencing, they said the outcome brought some measure of justice, though it could not undo what had happened. Karma appealed. The Montana Supreme Court unanimously upheld the conviction in 2017. Subsequent federal petitions were denied. He remains incarcerated. Case 8. Tony Martin and Fred Bareris, Norfolk, England, August 1999. The farmhouse known as Bleak House sat at the edge of remote farmland in Emnith-Hungate, Norfolk. It had been broken into before. The homeowner, 54-year-old farmer Anthony Martin, had reported those incidents to authorities. He had documented the losses. He had become, by his own account and the accounts of those who knew him, increasingly isolated and increasingly afraid. By the night of August 20th, 1999, Martin was positioned at the top of the staircase inside the darkened house with a pump-action shotgun he was legally prohibited from possessing. He had lost his license 5 years earlier after discharging a weapon at a man's vehicle. The shotgun stayed anyway. 16-year-old Fred Bareris and 29-year-old Brendan Fearon had broken in through a ground-floor window. They moved through the lower rooms. Martin fired down from the landing above them. 3 shots total, 1 from the staircase, 2 more as the intruders turned and ran toward the window they'd entered. The forensic evidence established the trajectories, downward, from an elevated position into a dark interior. Bareris was struck from behind. Pellets entered his back and legs. He made it out the window and collapsed just outside the property. Fearon, hit in the leg, escaped into the night and was located later. Fred Bareris was 16 years old. He died at the scene. He and Fearon had not been carrying firearms. They had gone there to steal. The Crown Prosecution Service brought charges against Martin under English law, where the standard for self-defense requires that the force used be reasonable. Shooting a retreating intruder in the back from a protected elevated position with an illegally held weapon. That sequence, prosecutors argued, exceeded what the law permitted. The jury agreed. In April 2000, Martin was convicted of murder and wounding with intent. He received a life sentence for the murder charge and concurrent sentences for the wounding and firearms offenses. His defense team appealed, presenting psychiatric evidence that had not been available at trial. Evaluations diagnosed Martin with paranoid personality disorder and, later, Asperger's syndrome. The Court of Appeal accepted that these conditions had substantially impaired his judgment on the night of the shooting. The murder conviction was reduced to manslaughter on grounds of diminished responsibility. His sentence was cut to 5 years. He served approximately 3 years before release on license in July 2003. The Martin case became one of the most publicly debated home defense incidents in British legal history. One side argued that a repeatedly victimized farmer who lived in isolation had been abandoned by authorities and ultimately punished for defending himself. The other noted that Bareris was shot in the back while fleeing and that Fearon's presence ended with a wounding charge, not death. Outcomes shaped by the exact moment and direction each shot was fired. The law's answer was encoded in both verdicts, the original conviction and the reduced one. Martin had gone further than the law allowed. The medical findings explained part of why. But Fred Bareris remained dead at 16, and the legal consequences, even in reduced form, followed. Case 9, Ricky Slater and Benjamin, Batterham, Hamilton, New South Wales, Australia, March 2016. 33-year-old Benjamin Batterham was awake in his home in the Newcastle suburb of Hamilton when he heard movement he hadn't expected. It was just after 3:20 in the morning on March 26, 2016. 40-year-old Ricky Slater had entered the house carrying a shoulder bag. Inside the bag, 3 knives, cannabis, and methamphetamine. He had passed through interior rooms and, according to the later reconstruction, came near the bedroom where Batterham's infant daughter had been sleeping, though neither the child nor her mother was in the home that night. Batterham confronted Slater. Slater fled. Batterham chased him out of the house and into the driveway. What happened outside is where the case became legally complicated. A neighbor who opened his door reported seeing Batterham with Slater on the ground, holding him in a chokehold and delivering multiple punches. Several neighbors called to Batterham and urged him to stop. The struggle continued until Slater went unresponsive. Paramedics and police arrived within minutes. Slater suffered multiple cardiac arrests. He was transported to hospital. He died the following day. The investigation produced a case file that turned on several competing factors. The toxicology report showed high levels of methamphetamine in Slater's system. Medical examiners found evidence of existing heart disease. Specialists who testified at trial explained that both conditions, stimulant toxicity and underlying coronary disease, significantly elevated the risk of sudden cardiac arrest under physical stress. One expert told the jury that the chokehold may have contributed to Slater's collapse, but was unlikely to be the sole cause of death. That medical uncertainty became the axis of the legal proceedings. Batterham was charged with murder. His defense argued that he had discovered an armed intruder near his infant daughter's room and had pursued and restrained Slater for the purpose of holding him until police arrived. The prosecution argued that the duration and nature of the chokehold, applied after Slater was already subdued, constituted excessive, unjustified force. After 2 weeks of trial, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty on all counts. They accepted Batterham's account of defending his home and his right to effect a citizen's arrest of an armed intruder who had entered unlawfully. The medical evidence, which could not definitively attribute death to the chokehold alone, was central to that conclusion. A subsequent judicial review of the prosecution's decision to bring charges found it had been unreasonable given the weight of the medical evidence. The court granted Batterham the right to seek recovery of his legal costs. Case 10. Keandre Funches and the Marietta homeowner. Marietta, Georgia, August 2017. At approximately 2:30 in the morning on August 3, 2017, 27-year-old Keandre Funches entered a home on Greer Street in Marietta, Georgia. He had been brought inside by a man identified as Javarian Mitchell, who had access to the property. The homeowner, a woman living in the residence with her 3 children, was awake. When she stepped out of her bedroom, she found Funches inside her home. According to her statements to investigators, he was armed and made threats she believed were credible. She went back for the handgun she kept in the house. She fired during the confrontation. Funches died inside the property. When officers arrived, they detained the homeowner and her husband for questioning. Her children were placed temporarily with relatives while the investigation moved forward. Police turned their attention immediately to Mitchell. He was arrested the same day and charged with aggravated assault, false imprisonment, cruelty to children, and counts tied to felony murder statutes for facilitating the home invasion. Detectives concluded that Mitchell had knowingly given an armed individual access to an occupied home where children were present. Toxicology conducted on Funches revealed methamphetamine in his system. Medical findings also indicated he may have had underlying health conditions. These factors became relevant during the legal proceedings when questions arose about whether the homeowner's actions alone constituted the sole cause of death. Despite those questions, the district attorney initially pursued homicide charges against the homeowner. The case went to trial. The defense emphasized that their client had been a mother confronted in the early morning hours by an armed intruder who threatened her and her children inside her own home. They framed every action she took as a direct response to a clear and immediate threat. Medical expert testimony reinforced the uncertainty about causation. One specialist testified that Funches's drug use and physical condition could not be separated from the outcome. Another corroborated that separating the effects of methamphetamine toxicity from the impact of the shooting was not medically possible with certainty. The jury returned a verdict of not guilty on all homicide charges. They concluded that the homeowner had acted in defense of herself and her children. A subsequent judicial review found that the prosecution's decision to bring charges had been unreasonable. The court ruled that the evidence had not supported a definitive criminal theory and granted the homeowner the right to seek recovery of her legal costs. Mitchell's prosecution continued separately. 10 cases. 10 documented confrontations between homeowners and intruders. 5 clearings. 4 convictions. 1 manslaughter reduction on appeal. The outcomes didn't turn on whether someone had broken in. In every one of these cases, an intruder entered property they had no right to enter. In every one, the homeowner responded with deadly force. What separated the justified from the criminal was always the same question, asked at a specific moment. Was the threat still real when the final shot was fired? Joe Horn shot 2 men carrying stolen property on his neighbor's lawn and was cleared by a grand jury. Byron Smith shot an unconscious teenager in his own basement and will spend the rest of his life in prison. Jerome Ersland fired a first shot that investigators called justified and 5 more that a jury called murder. The moment the threat ended is the moment the law's protection ended. In every case where a conviction followed, that's where the timeline turned. Across different states, different countries, different legal systems, the principle held. Across all 10 of these cases, the evidence was documented. The recordings existed. The cameras ran. The forensics established trajectories and timing. And in each case, the outcome followed the facts. These are the kinds of cases Daily Crime Archive covers, fully documented, fact-driven, and told with enough detail that the legal decisions actually make sense. If you watched this one all the way through, you're exactly who this channel is built for. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell so the next one finds you automatically. Drop a comment and tell us which of these 10 cases surprised you most. We read everything. We'll see you in the next one.